welcome to Tales in the Dark. I know many of you enjoy relaxing with these videos, so I recommend turning down the volume until my voice is barely audible. It'll make the experience even more soothing. Before you close your eyes, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and enjoy listening. Story 1. The soft patter of rain against ancient stone walls filled the evening air with its gentle melody, a natural lullaby that seemed to whisper secrets from centuries past. I stood before the weathered gates of the castle, my breath visible in the cool autumn air, as wisps of mist curled around my feet like ethereal cats seeking attention. The medieval structure loomed before me, its spires disappearing into the perpetual fog that had given the castle its mysterious name. As a historian specializing in architectural preservation, I had visited countless historical buildings, but something about this place felt different. The mist that surrounded the castle hadn't lifted in living memory, according to local legends. Even on the brightest summer days, the castle remained shrouded in a permanent veil of gray, as if it existed in its own pocket of reality. The heavy iron key in my hand felt cold against my skin as I inserted it into the ancient lock. The mechanism turned with surprising smoothness, as though it had been waiting for my arrival. The door opened with a low, resonant creak that seemed to echo through the empty courtyard beyond. The sound of my footsteps on the wet cobblestones created soft, rhythmic splashes that accompanied me across the entrance. Inside the courtyard, the mist seemed to grow thicker, swirling in patterns that almost appeared deliberate. The scent of wet stone and old roses filled my nostrils, though I could see no flowers in the overgrown garden beds. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime tinkled softly, its gentle notes carrying through the still air despite the absence of any breeze. My assignment was simple. Spend 1 week documenting the castle's architectural features for potential restoration. The previous surveyor had left suddenly, leaving behind a half-finished report and a curious note about voices in the walls. I had dismissed it as an attempt to break their contract without penalty, but standing here now, I understood why someone might imagine such things. The main hall welcomed me with the musty scent of aged tapestries and wooden panels that had absorbed centuries of history. My footsteps echoed differently here, creating soft, hollow sounds that seemed to linger longer than they should. The beam of my flashlight revealed intricate carvings along the walls, faces and figures that appeared to shift and change when viewed from different angles. As I set up my temporary office in what had once been the castle's library, I couldn't shake the feeling that the room was already occupied. Not in a threatening way, but rather like walking into a quiet study where someone had just been sitting moments before. The desk I chose still held the warmth of afternoon sun, though the windows had been covered in mist all day. That first night, I discovered something peculiar about the castle's acoustics. As I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep, I could hear what sounded like distant conversations, not clear enough to make out words, but carrying the distinct cadence of human speech. The sound seemed to travel through the stone walls themselves, as if the very architecture of the castle had absorbed centuries of discussions and was now playing them back in an endless loop. The following days settled into a strange routine. Each morning I would wake to find my survey equipment slightly rearranged, though never damaged or missing. My compass would point in different directions depending on which room I stood in, and my digital cameras would capture odd light anomalies that I couldn't explain. Yet none of it felt threatening. Rather, it was as if the castle itself was engaging in a gentle game of hide and seek. In the Great Hall, I discovered that the temperature would drop suddenly in specific spots, creating perfect circles of cold air that would follow me as I worked. When I spoke aloud, which I began doing to break the silence, my words would sometimes echo back in slightly different tones, as if someone else was repeating them just a fraction of a second later. The castle's windows proved particularly fascinating. Though covered in mist on both sides, they would occasionally clear for brief moments, revealing glimpses of landscapes that couldn't possibly exist outside. Gardens in full bloom during rainfall, summer meadows in the middle of night, snow-covered courtyards while leaves fell from autumn trees. These visions would fade as quickly as they appeared, leaving me to question whether I had truly seen them. One evening, as I reviewed my notes by candlelight, the castle's old wiring having proved unreliable, I noticed a pattern in the architectural anomalies I had documented. The irregular spacing of windows, the slightly off-center doorways, the unexpected angles of corridors. When mapped together, they formed a sort of spiral pattern, centering on a point in the castle that didn't seem to exist in any of the floor plans. The deeper I delved into my research, the more I realized that the castle's mysterious reputation might stem from its very design. The unusual acoustic properties, the way light bent around corners it shouldn't, the persistent mist, all of it suggested purposeful construction rather than supernatural occurrence. But to what end? What architect would design a building that seemed to exist in multiple times at once? On my fifth night, I woke to the sound of music. Not the wind through the corridors or the echo of ancient conversations, but actual music, soft, melodic, and somehow familiar, though I couldn't place it. Following the sound led me through a series of rooms I was certain I had never seen before, though they appeared on none of my carefully drawn maps. The music grew louder as I approached what appeared to be a ballroom. Through the doorway, I could see light spilling out, not harsh electric light or the warm glow of candles, but something in between, something that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the melody. The mist had followed me inside the castle, and it now swirled around my feet in time with the music. Standing in that doorway, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity. The castle wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was something far more remarkable. The persistent mist, the acoustic anomalies, the shifting architecture, they were all part of a grand design. The castle existed in a place where time wasn't quite linear, where moments from different eras could overlap and intersect like layers of translucent fabric. I never entered the ballroom that night. Something told me that crossing that threshold would change everything, and I wasn't ready for that change. Instead, I stood and watched as the mist danced to music from another time, catching occasional glimpses of figures moving through the light, their forms suggested rather than defined. When morning came, I couldn't find the ballroom again. The corridor that had led to it now ended in a solid wall, though my instruments suggested there was space beyond it. In my notes, I wrote about acoustic properties and architectural anomalies, about light refraction and the peculiar properties of fog in enclosed spaces. The official report contained nothing about music or dancing figures or rooms that appeared and disappeared. As I prepared to leave on the seventh day, I found myself reluctant to go. The castle had shared its secrets with me, not all at once, but in gentle whispers and subtle suggestions. The mist that had seemed so mysterious upon my arrival now felt like an old friend. Its cool touch a reminder that some places exist outside our understanding of time and space. I locked the heavy door behind me, knowing that my key would soon be passed to another surveyor, another historian seeking to understand this remarkable place. As I walked away, I glanced back one last time. Through the mist, I could have sworn I saw lights moving in the windows, heard the faint echo of that haunting melody. But perhaps that was just my imagination, or perhaps it was the castle's way of saying goodbye. The official report declared the castle structurally sound, but in need of minor repairs. I made no mention of the things I couldn't explain, the moments that defied rational analysis. Some mysteries, I decided, deserve to remain mysteries, and somewhere, Behind its veil of eternal mist, I knew the castle would continue its gentle dance through time, revealing its secrets only to those who were willing to listen to the stories whispered by its ancient stones. Even now, months later, I sometimes dream of that place. In my dreams, I finally step through the ballroom doorway, finally join the dance that exists between moments. And when I wake, I can still feel the cool touch of mist on my skin, still hear the echo of music played in a room that exists outside of time. The castle of eternal mist had shared its greatest secret with me, that some places are not meant to be understood, only experienced, their mysteries adding texture to the fabric of reality itself. Story 2. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep resonant chimes echoing through the quiet house. I sat in my favorite armchair, wrapped in the soft warmth of a wool blanket, listening to the gentle patter of rain against the windows. The house creaked and settled around me, familiar sounds that normally brought comfort, but tonight felt somehow different. A single lamp cast a warm golden glow across the living room, creating pools of soft light that faded into deep shadows in the corners. The rain had been falling steadily since afternoon, bringing with it an early darkness that seemed to press against the windows like a living thing. Steam rose lazily from my cup of chamomile tea, carrying its subtle floral scent through the air. I had always loved these quiet moments alone, when the world outside seemed to fade away and time moved at its own peaceful pace. The old house had been in my family for generations, its wooden floors and weathered walls holding countless memories within their grain. Tonight, though, there was something in the air, a thickness, a presence that made the silence feel heavy with anticipation. The first unusual thing I noticed was the temperature. Despite the warmth of my blanket and the tea, there was a persistent coolness in the room, as if cold air was seeping in from somewhere. I drew the blanket tighter around my shoulders, watching as the steam from my tea curled and twisted in strange patterns before dissipating into the shadows. Then came the sounds, subtle at first, barely distinguishable from the rain and the house's usual nighttime symphony. Soft scratching noises, like fingernails trailing gently across wood, seemed to emanate from the walls. I told myself it was just the old maple tree outside, its branches brushing against the house in the wind. But there was no wind tonight, only the steady drum of rain. The shadows in the corners of the room appeared to shift and dance in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned to look directly at them, they were perfectly still. The lamp's light flickered almost imperceptibly, creating momentary shapes that disappeared before I could fully register them. I found myself sinking deeper into my chair, not out of fear, but rather a strange sort of curiosity. My grandmother had often told me stories about this house when I was young. She spoke of things that lived in the spaces between moments, entities that existed just beyond the edge of perception. "They're not harmful," she would say, her voice soft and knowing. "They're simply curious about us, just as we are about them." I had always assumed these were just bedtime stories meant to make the dark less frightening for a child. The scratching sounds grew slightly more distinct, now seeming to come from inside the walls themselves. They had a pattern to them, almost like language. 3 soft scrapes, a pause, 2 more, another pause. It was rhythmic, almost musical in its repetition. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me like a strange lullaby. When I opened them again, I noticed something peculiar about the shadows on the wall opposite my chair. They seemed deeper than before, more defined, and within their depths, I could almost make out movement. It was like watching dark water ripple in moonlight, except there was no moon tonight, only the steady rain and my lamp's warm glow. The air grew cooler still, and I watched as my breath formed small clouds in front of my face. The steam from my tea had stopped rising altogether, though the cup was still warm in my hands. The scratching sounds had moved, now seeming to come from behind the large mirror that hung above the fireplace. I found myself studying my reflection, noting how the shadows behind me appeared to shift and flow like silk in a gentle breeze. Then I saw them, or rather, I saw the suggestion of them. In the mirror's reflection, barely visible in the dim light, were hands. They emerged from the darkness behind my chair, not solid things, but rather the absence of light in the shape of hands. They moved with impossible grace, their fingers dancing through the air like smoke, never quite touching anything, but clearly real in their own strange way. I remained still, my heart beating steady and slow in my chest. The hands continued their ethereal dance, weaving patterns in the air that seemed to carry meaning just beyond my understanding. They reminded me of the way my grandmother's hands would move as she told her stories, elegant and expressive, speaking a language all their own. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, providing a backdrop to this surreal display. The hands multiplied slowly until the darkness behind me was filled with their flowing movements. It should have been frightening, perhaps, but instead it felt like watching a beautiful and intimate performance, one that few had ever been privileged to witness. Time seemed to lose its meaning as I watched them dance. The grandfather clock's chimes came and went, but I paid them no mind. The hands moved in perfect harmony with the scratching sounds, which had evolved into a complex symphony of soft scrapes and gentle taps. The whole room felt alive with their presence, every shadow holding the potential for movement, every dark corner concealing more of their mysterious choreography. Eventually, I felt my eyelids growing heavy, though I fought to keep them open, not wanting this extraordinary moment to end. The hands seemed to notice my fatigue, their movements becoming slower, more soothing. The scratching sounds softened until they were barely audible beneath the rain's steady rhythm. As sleep began to overtake me, I felt something that might have been a touch, the lightest pressure on my shoulder, cool but not unpleasant, like the brush of a falling autumn leaf. The hands in the mirror were receding now, flowing back into the darkness from which they had emerged. Their dance became slower, more deliberate, as if they were performing a lullaby just for me. The last thing I remember before drifting off was the sight of a single hand remaining in the mirror, its fingers moving in what looked like a gentle wave goodbye. The rain continued to fall, and the shadows settled back into their corners. But the room felt different now, not empty, but peaceful, like a theater after the final curtain call of a beautiful performance. When I awoke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the room looked exactly as it always had. My teacup sat on the side table, empty now, and the mirror reflected nothing but the ordinary contents of my living room. But there, on the wooden floor beneath the mirror, I found something extraordinary. A complex pattern traced in the dust, like the record of a dance performed by invisible hands. I never cleaned away that pattern, and on quiet rainy nights, when I sit in my chair with a cup of tea, I sometimes glimpse those hands again, emerging from the darkness to perform their mysterious dance. They've become a comfort to me now, a reminder of my grandmother's stories and the magic that exists in the spaces between moments. Sometimes if I'm very still and the night is very quiet, I can even hear them scratching their gentle messages into the walls, speaking a language that I'm slowly, ever so slowly, beginning to understand. Story 3. The autumn wind whispered through the ancient trees, carrying with it the sweet scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. I sat in my study, wrapped in the comfortable silence of early evening, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted warm patterns on my weathered desk. The gentle ticking of my grandfather's clock provided a soothing rhythm to my thoughts, each second melting seamlessly into the next. My daily routine of writing in my journal had become a meditative practice, one that helped ease the transition from day to night. The soft scratch of my fountain pen against paper created a delicate harmony with the clock's steady heartbeat. Outside my window, the garden lay shrouded in the growing twilight, its familiar shapes slowly dissolving into deeper shadows. It was during one of these peaceful evening sessions that I first noticed something peculiar. As I gazed absently into the garden, my eyes were drawn to a subtle movement among the overgrown hedges. At first I dismissed it as nothing more than the wind playing with the branches, but there was something about the way the shadows seemed to part and flow that caught my attention. The more I observed, the more I began to notice patterns in the darkness. The shadows appeared to move with purpose, like water flowing around invisible obstacles. They created what looked like a pathway, one I had never noticed before, despite having lived in this house for over a decade. The curious thing was that this path seemed to shift and change, never quite staying in the same place for more than a few moments. Over the next few weeks, I found myself spending more and more time watching the garden as dusk settled in. The weather grew cooler, and I took to wrapping myself in a soft wool blanket while I sat in my favorite armchair by the window. The sound of leaves rustling against the glass became a constant companion, like nature's own lullaby. I began to notice other changes in the garden. Sometimes in the corner of my eye, I would catch glimpses of soft, phosphorescent lights hovering just above the ground where the shadow path appeared. They reminded me of the fireflies that used to dance in my childhood garden, but these lights were different, more ethereal, more deliberate in their movements. One particularly quiet evening, as rain pattered gently against the window panes, I noticed something new in the garden. Among the usual shifting shadows, there appeared to be footprints forming in the dewy grass. They materialized slowly, one after another, as if someone invisible was taking a leisurely stroll along the mysterious path. The prints were unlike any I had seen before, neither human nor animal, but something in between, leaving slight indentations that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. The rain created a mesmerizing curtain of silver threads, and through it the garden took on an almost dreamlike quality. The old stone bird bath, which had stood empty for years, now collected water that seemed to glow with a subtle, pearl-like luminescence. Drops falling into the basin created ripples that spread outward in perfect circles, each one catching and reflecting the strange, ambient light that had no clear source. As autumn deepened into winter, the garden's transformation became more pronounced. Frost patterns appeared on the ground each morning, but they didn't follow the natural contours of the land. Instead, they formed intricate spirals and whorls that seemed to map out the shadow path I had observed. These patterns would linger long after the sun had risen, defying the natural order of things. My journal entries grew longer and more detailed as I documented these subtle changes. The more I wrote, the more I began to notice connections between different events. The appearance of the lights often coincided with the phase of the moon, growing stronger as it waned and dimming as it waxed. The shadow path seemed to shift its course in response to the direction of the wind, but always maintained certain fixed points in its journey through the garden. On some nights, I would hear soft musical notes carried on the breeze, so faint that I couldn't be sure whether they were real or simply products of my imagination. The melody, if it could be called that, seemed to echo the rhythm of my grandfather's clock, but with additional layers of complexity that made it feel both familiar and utterly alien. The wooden floorboards of my study began to develop their own patterns, visible only in certain lights. Dark whorls in the grain appeared to mirror the path I observed in the garden, as if the house itself was responding to the presence of whatever created these mysterious phenomena. The air in my study grew thick with the scent of old books and wood polish. But underneath these familiar smells, I detected something else. a subtle fragrance like rain-washed stone and night-blooming flowers. Winter's short days meant I spent more time observing the garden in darkness. The shadow path became more distinct in the longer nights, and I began to notice that it seemed to be leading somewhere. Beyond the boundaries of my garden, where the old stone wall met the woods, there appeared to be an opening that hadn't existed before. It was as if the shadows had worn away at the reality of the wall, creating a doorway to somewhere else. I never felt afraid during these observations, despite their otherworldly nature. There was a profound sense of peace that accompanied each new discovery, as if I were being gradually introduced to something that had always existed just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. The presence in the garden, whatever it might be, seemed to respect the boundary of my home, never attempting to cross the threshold. Sometimes, in the depths of night when sleep eluded me, I would watch as small objects in the garden, leaves, twigs, and occasionally even small stones, would move along the shadow path of their own accord. They would dance and swirl in the air, tracing patterns that reminded me of ancient scripts I had seen in old books. These airborne ballets would last for hours, each object eventually settling back to earth in positions that seemed carefully chosen. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle, I developed a theory that the shadow path was not just a phenomenon in my garden, but perhaps part of a larger network of similar paths that crisscross the world in ways invisible to most eyes. The thought was comforting rather than disturbing. The idea that there might be layers of reality existing alongside our own, occasionally revealing themselves to those who took the time to notice. My dreams began to take on new qualities, filled with images of vast networks of shadowy paths stretching across landscapes I had never seen. In these dreams, I would follow the paths through forests of crystalline trees and over fields of grass that chimed softly when touched by the wind. I would wake from these dreams feeling refreshed, as if I had actually traveled to these places. The garden became a source of endless fascination, each day bringing new subtle changes to observe and record. The shadow path continued its mysterious meanderings, and though I never saw what created it, I felt a growing sense of connection to whatever force shaped these gentle mysteries. It was as if I had been granted access to a secret chapter in the book of nature, one that few others had the privilege to read. As I sit here now, watching the shadows lengthen across my garden once again, I wonder about the others who might have noticed similar phenomena in their own spaces. Perhaps there are people all over the world who have discovered their own shadow paths, each one unique yet connected to all the others in ways we can't fully comprehend. The grandfather clock continues its steady counting of seconds, and the shadows continue their dance outside my window. I've come to understand that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but rather experienced and appreciated for what they are. Gentle reminders that the world is far more wonderful and complex than we imagine. The shadow path remains, offering its silent invitation to wonder, while the garden holds its secrets close, revealing them only to those who have learned to watch and wait with patience and an open heart. In the end, I've found that the greatest gift of the shadow path has been the peace it brings, the quiet assurance that there is magic in the world if we only take the time to notice it. And so I continue my evening vigils, content in the knowledge that some questions are better left as questions, their answers hiding in the spaces between shadow and light, in the gentle rustle of leaves, and in the soft ticking of time passing in the night. Story 4. The snow fell in gentle waves, each flake a tiny dancer in the fading winter light. I sat in my grandfather's old cabin, watching through the frost-kissed window as the forest transformed into a crystalline wonderland. The wooden walls creaked softly around me, their aged timbers shifting and settling in the cold, while the fire in the stone hearth cast warm, flickering shadows across the room. I had come here seeking solitude, a chance to write my novel in peace, away from the constant distractions of modern life. The cabin had stood empty since my grandfather's passing 3 years ago, and now in the depths of winter, it seemed to welcome me with its familiar sense of pine wood and old books. That first evening, as I settled into the worn leather armchair by the fire, I noticed something peculiar. The quality of silence here was different from what I remembered from childhood visits. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of nature at rest, but rather a listening kind of silence, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The thought made me smile at first, a writer's imagination running wild, I told myself. The grandfather clock in the corner marked time with its steady heartbeat, its brass pendulum catching the firelight as it swung. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world in layers of white. I pulled the woolen blanket closer around my shoulders, inhaling the scent of lavender that still clung to it from my grandmother's cedar chest. As night deepened, the forest beyond my window became an intricate pattern of shadows and moonlit snow. The branches of the ancient pines swayed gently, their movement creating ever-changing patterns on the pristine white ground. That's when I first noticed the footprints. They appeared at the edge of the clearing, emerging from between two towering pines. But these weren't the familiar tracks of deer or rabbits that I'd grown used to seeing around the cabin. These prints were different, larger than any animal I knew should be in these woods, yet too small and delicate to be human. They formed a meandering path through the snow, leading to the old well that stood half hidden behind a cluster of snow-laden bushes. The rational part of my mind suggested that the strange shapes were simply the result of snow falling into existing tracks, distorting their true form. Yet something about their deliberate pattern held my attention. They seemed to dance across the snow, as if whatever had made them had been moving to music only it could hear. I found myself drawn to my grandfather's old study, where his journals still lined the shelves in neat rows. He had been a naturalist, spending decades documenting the flora and fauna of these woods. Perhaps he had noticed something similar during his time here. As I ran my fingers along the leather spines, the scent of aged paper and ink filled the air. The journal I selected was from his final winter, its pages filled with his familiar, flowing handwriting. As I began to read, the cabin seemed to grow quieter, the crackling of the fire fading into the background. My grandfather's words painted a picture of a forest far more mysterious than I had ever imagined. He wrote of lights seen dancing between the trees on moonless nights, of songs carried on the wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But most intriguingly, he described tracks in the snow, tracks that matched exactly what I had just seen outside my window. The more I read, the more I realized that my grandfather had been pursuing something in these woods, something that had eluded his scientific documentation. His later entries became more contemplative, filled with references to old folklore about forest spirits and winter guardians. It wasn't like him to drift into fancy. He had always been a man of science and careful observation. A soft tapping at the window drew my attention away from the journal. The sound was gentle, like fingernails lightly drumming on glass. When I looked up, I saw only the reflection of the study in the dark window, the shelves of books stretching away into shadow. But for a moment, just a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of something pale and graceful moving among the trees. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sun transforming the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. The strange tracks had vanished, filled in by the night snowfall. Yet the sense of something extraordinary lingering just beyond my perception remained. As the days passed, I fell into a routine, writing during the day and reading my grandfather's journals in the evening. The forest seemed to watch me with benevolent curiosity, Sometimes, while working at my desk, I would catch movement in the corner of my eye, a flash of white against white, gone before I could turn my head. The silence would deepen in these moments, becoming almost tangible. One evening, as the early winter darkness was settling in, I found a curious entry in one of the older journals. My grandfather described finding a clearing deep in the woods where the snow fell differently, swirling in patterns that defied the wind. He had followed the strange tracks there multiple times, but never managed to see what made them. However, he wrote about feeling a presence, something ancient and wise, that seemed to acknowledge him without ever revealing itself. That night, I dreamed of snow that danced like stars falling from the sky, of music that sounded like crystal wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and of something moving through the forest with impossible grace. When I woke, the dream clung to me like frost on a window pane, and I knew I needed to find that clearing. I spent the next few days carefully mapping out the area based on my grandfather's notes. The forest had changed since his time, but certain landmarks remained constant. The lightning-struck oak, the rock formation that resembled a sleeping bear, the stream that never quite froze, even in the deepest winter. As I prepared for my expedition, I noticed small changes around the cabin. Objects would be slightly moved when I wasn't looking. A book turned to face a different direction. A cup shifted to the other side of the table. The sense of being watched grew stronger, but it didn't feel threatening. Rather, it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. The morning I chose to search for the clearing dawned still and cold, with a pearly gray sky that promised more snow. I dressed warmly and packed a small bag with water, some food, and my grandfather's journal. The snow crunched softly under my boots as I set out, following the careful map I had drawn. The forest was extraordinarily quiet that day, the silence broken only by the occasional soft thump of snow falling from overladen branches. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to grow older, their trunks wider and more gnarled, their branches reaching up into a canopy that filtered the weak winter sunlight into subtle shades of blue and silver. I began to notice small things that seemed out of place, branches that curved in impossible angles, icicles that caught the light in ways that made them look like wind chimes, snow that sparkled with colors that shouldn't have been there. The air grew thicker, as if the atmosphere itself was changing, becoming charged with something I couldn't quite name. Then I saw them, the tracks. They appeared suddenly, as if their maker had simply materialized in the middle of a pristine snowfield. They led forward, dancing and weaving between the trees, and I followed, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in my chest. The clearing, when I found it, took my breath away. It was perfectly circular, surrounded by ancient pines whose branches formed a natural dome overhead. The snow here moved differently, swirling in lazy spirals even though there was no wind. Small ice crystals hung in the air, catching the light and throwing rainbow fragments across the white ground. I stood at the edge, watching the dance of snow and light, understanding at last what my grandfather had been trying to document. This wasn't something that could be captured in scientific notes or careful observations. It was something that had to be experienced, had to be felt. As I stood there, the silence deepened, becoming almost musical in its intensity. The swirling snow seemed to take on patterns, forming shapes that were almost but not quite recognizable. And there, at the corner of my vision, I caught a glimpse of something moving with impossible grace through the trees. I didn't turn to look directly at it. Something told me that would break whatever spell held this place in its grip. Instead, I stood perfectly still, letting the snow settle on my shoulders, becoming part of the forest's winter dream. Time passed differently in that clearing. When I finally turned to leave, the light was fading, though it felt as if I had been there for only moments. The tracks that had led me there were gone, filled in by fresh snow that had fallen without my noticing. That evening, as I sat in my grandfather's study recording what I had experienced, I understood why his later journals had become more contemplative. Some things couldn't be explained through scientific observation alone. Some mysteries were meant to be experienced rather than understood, felt rather than documented. The forest outside my window continues its winter dreaming, and sometimes, in the depths of night, I hear what might be singing on the wind, or catch a glimpse of dance-like movements in the swirling snow. I've come to understand that my grandfather's greatest discovery wasn't something he could prove or explain. It was the knowledge that some secrets are meant to remain secrets, their magic preserved in the space between what we can see and what we can only sense. Now, as I write my own story, I find myself drawing inspiration from the mystery that lives in these snowy woods. The tracks still appear sometimes, always leading toward that special clearing, but I no longer feel the need to follow them. Instead, I've learned to appreciate the gift of knowing that some questions don't need answers, and some mysteries are more beautiful when they remain unsolved. The snow continues to fall outside my window, each flake a tiny dancer in the winter light, and somewhere in the forest, something ancient and beautiful continues its eternal dance, leaving only the faintest of tracks in the freshly fallen snow. Story 5. The gentle patter of rain against weathered shingles filled the evening air as I sat in my grandmother's old rocking chair, watching shadows dance across the wall of my study. The warm glow of my reading lamp cast a comfortable circle of light around me, while the rest of the house remained wrapped in a soft darkness that seemed to breathe with the wind outside. I had always found comfort in these quiet moments, when the world beyond my walls faded into nothing more than distant whispers and subtle movements. My attention drifted to the aged leather-bound journal resting in my lap, its pages yellowed and crisp with time. I had discovered it earlier that day while sorting through boxes in the attic, tucked away beneath layers of old photographs and forgotten memories. The cover bore no markings, save for a curious indentation that might once have held a nameplate. As I ran my fingers across its surface, the leather felt unusually cool to the touch, almost as if it held within its pages a fragment of winter. The rain's rhythm grew steadier, providing a soothing backdrop as I carefully opened the journal. The first few pages were blank, their emptiness somehow more striking than if they had been filled with words. It wasn't until the 7th page that I found the first entry, written in an elegant hand that seemed to flow across the paper like water. I write this account not out of fear, but out of necessity. The window that appeared in my study last night defies all rational explanation, and I find myself compelled to document its existence before doubt begins to cloud my memory. A sudden gust of wind caused the house to creak, and I found myself glancing up at my own study window. The glass pane reflected my lamp's light back at me, creating a mirror effect that made it impossible to see the darkness beyond. I returned to the journal, drawn deeper into its mystery. It began on a night much like this one, when the autumn rain painted everything in shades of gray and silver. I was organizing my books when I first noticed it. A window frame that had no business being there, set into the wall where I knew no window had existed before. But it was the absence of glass that truly caught my attention. The frame stood empty, a perfect rectangle of nothingness that seemed to hover between worlds. The description sent a subtle shiver down my spine, not of fear but of recognition. My eyes were drawn to the far wall of my study, where shadows seemed to gather more densely than before. The rain continued its gentle symphony, but now each drop seemed to carry a whispered message I couldn't quite understand. The curious thing about the window was not its sudden appearance, but rather what lay beyond it. When viewed directly, it showed only darkness. But from the corner of one's eye, glimpses of another place could be seen. A room that mirrored my own study, yet was fundamentally different in ways I struggled to describe. The books on those distant shelves had titles I could never quite read, and the furniture cast shadows that moved independently of any light source. I found myself shifting in my chair, suddenly aware of the weight of the air around me. The house's familiar creaks and settlings took on new meaning, as if they were trying to speak in a language just beyond my understanding. I continued reading, each word drawing me deeper into the journal's narrative. I have begun to notice small changes in my study since the window's appearance. Books rearrange themselves when I'm not looking, but always in a way that makes more sense than my original organization. The room feels larger in the early hours of morning, as if it's breathing in time with the dawn. And sometimes, in that space between wakefulness and sleep, I hear someone humming a melody I almost recognize. The next several pages detailed subtle occurrences. The way shadows would stretch longer than they should on certain evenings, how the temperature would drop unexpectedly in specific corners of the room, the curious behavior of dust motes that seemed to dance in patterns too precise to be random. Each observation was recorded with a methodical precision that lent credibility to the increasing strangeness of the accounts. As I read, I became aware of a change in the quality of silence around me. The rain's percussion had softened, creating pockets of quiet that seemed to pulse with possibility. The lamp's light felt less certain now, its boundaries less defined. I found myself reading more slowly, savoring each word as if it might be a clue to something larger. Last night, I finally gathered the courage to approach the window directly. The emptiness within its frame seemed to ripple like water when I drew near, though I felt no movement in the air. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, but stopped just short of where the glass should have been. In that moment, I swear I heard someone on the other side do the same. My own hand had begun to tingle sympathetically as I read this passage. The room around me felt both familiar and strange, as if I were seeing it through layers of memory that weren't entirely my own. The shadows in the corners had grown deeper, but not in a threatening way. Rather, they seemed to be offering shelter to something just beyond my perception. I've started leaving books open to specific pages before going to bed. In the morning, I often find them turned to different passages, always relevant to whatever problem has been occupying my thoughts. Last week, when I was struggling with a particularly complex mathematical equation, I awoke to find my old calculus textbook open to exactly the theorem I needed. The helpful presence behind these acts feels neither malevolent nor benign, simply curious, perhaps even lonely. The journal continued for many more pages, each entry building upon the last in subtle ways. The writer described how the window seemed to respond to emotions, widening slightly during moments of intellectual excitement and narrowing during periods of doubt. They noted how the air near the window would sometimes carry the scent of books they had loved in childhood, or hints of tea they had never actually brewed. As I read deeper into the journal, I began to notice something unusual about my own surroundings. The shadows cast by my bookshelves had taken on a quality that wasn't quite natural, not darker or lighter, but somehow more meaningful. Each time I looked up from the journal, the room seemed slightly different, as if it had shifted in some imperceptible way during the moments my attention was elsewhere. I've come to understand that the window is not so much a portal as it is a conversation. It doesn't lead anywhere in the physical sense, but rather opens into the space where thoughts and memories acquire weight and substance. The books that rearrange themselves, the shadows that move with purpose, the whispered mathematics in the early hours, these are not intrusions from another world, but rather the world itself trying to speak in the only language it knows. The final entry in the journal was written in a hand that seemed both more hurried and more peaceful than the others. Tonight, I realized that the window has always been here. It's not that it appeared one day. Rather, I finally became quiet enough to notice its presence. The empty frame is not an absence of glass, but rather an invitation to see beyond the barriers we create between ourselves and the deeper mysteries of existence. I no longer try to understand it in any traditional sense. Instead, I simply sit with it, allowing its presence to remind me that reality is far more permeable than we imagine. As I closed the journal, I became aware of a subtle change in my study. The rain had stopped, though I couldn't remember when. The silence that filled its absence was rich with possibility. My eyes were drawn to the wall opposite my chair, where the shadows had gathered into a shape that almost suggested a frame. I sat very still, allowing my vision to soften. In that space between focus and perception, I began to understand what the journal's author had meant. The wall didn't contain a window in any physical sense, but rather the possibility of one. A space where the familiar boundaries of reality grew thin enough to whisper their secrets to those patient enough to listen. The lamp's light seemed to fade slightly, though I hadn't touched its switch. In that gentle dimming, the room around me felt vast and intimate at the same time, as if it extended far beyond its physical dimensions while still holding me in its careful embrace. I remained in my chair, breathing slowly, aware that I was now part of something that had been unfolding long before I found the journal. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked softly, and I smiled, recognizing it not as a sound but as a response. The study around me continued its subtle dance of light and shadow, and I felt no need to determine where reality ended and mystery began. Instead, I simply sat, allowing the evening to wrap around me like a familiar blanket, understanding that some questions are more valuable than their answers. As the night deepened, I placed the journal on my desk, knowing I would return to it again, but also knowing its true purpose had already been fulfilled. It had shown me how to look at the spaces between things, how to listen to the silence beneath sounds, and how to recognize that every room contains its own windowless window, waiting to be discovered by those willing to sit quietly enough to notice its presence. The darkness outside had grown complete, transforming my window into a mirror that reflected the room back at itself. In that reflection, for just a moment, I thought I saw something shift in the corner of my eye. Not a movement exactly, but rather the suggestion of one, like the memory of a breeze through an empty window frame. I let my eyes close, feeling the weight of understanding settle around me like gentle rain, knowing that some stories don't need endings to be complete. Story 6. The autumn breeze whispered through the garden, carrying with it the sweet scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. I sat at my desk beside the bay window, watching as golden light filtered through the branches of the old oak tree. The wooden swing that hung from its strongest limb caught my attention, swaying ever so slightly in the gentle wind. There was something oddly mesmerizing about its movement, a peaceful, rhythmic motion that seemed to invite contemplation. As evening approached and the sky transformed into a canvas of deep purples and muted oranges, I noticed something peculiar. The swing's movement had changed. While before it had merely shifted with the wind, now it moved with a distinct forward and backward motion, as if carrying an invisible passenger. The chains creaked softly, a sound that normally might have been unsettling, but instead felt strangely musical in the quiet of dusk. I had inherited this house from my grandmother just 3 months ago. The property came with decades of memories, stories whispered between generations, and objects that held their own quiet histories. The swing had been there as long as anyone could remember, its wooden seat weathered smooth by years of use and countless seasons of rain and sun. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the swing when I was young. She would sit in her favorite armchair by the fireplace, her silver hair catching the firelight, as she spoke of summer evenings spent watching neighborhood children play. There was always one story she seemed hesitant to share completely. Something about a particularly foggy autumn evening and a melody that drifted through the garden. She would always trail off, lost in thought, before changing the subject to something more mundane. That night, as I prepared for bed, the gentle creaking of the swing continued. The sound carried through my open window, accompanied by the rustle of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. Instead of feeling frightened, I found myself drawn into a state of peaceful contemplation. The rhythm of the swing became a sort of lullaby, its steady motion visible in the soft moonlight that filtered through the clouds. As I drifted between wakefulness and sleep, memories of my childhood visits to this house floated through my mind. I remembered watching the swing from this same window, wondering why grandmother never let me play on it after sunset. There had been rules about the swing. Never use it alone, never at night, and always thank it when you were done. At the time, I had dismissed these as the peculiar habits of an elderly woman, but now they stirred something in my consciousness. The next morning, I found myself drawn to the swing. The early sun cast long shadows across the dewy grass, and a light mist hung in the air. The swing was perfectly still now, as if it had never moved at all. I approached it slowly, taking in every detail: the worn grooves in the wooden seat, the slight oxidation of the chains where they met the branch, the way the morning light caught the beads of moisture on its surface. As I reached out to touch it, a cool breeze swept through the garden, carrying with it the faintest hint of a familiar perfume, grandmother's favorite lavender and rose water. The scent triggered a memory I had long forgotten. One evening, years ago, I had snuck out to the swing after dinner. As I approached it in the gathering darkness, I had heard the softest humming, a melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Before I could reach the swing, grandmother had appeared, gently but firmly leading me back inside. Days passed, and I found myself developing my own routine with the swing. During the day, it remained still, a silent sentinel in the garden. But as evening approached, it would begin its gentle motion, accompanied by that same ethereal melody I now remembered from my childhood. Rather than fear this unexplainable phenomenon, I began to look forward to it. The sound became a signal to slow down, to breathe deeply, to let go of the day's concerns. I started leaving small offerings near the base of the oak tree: fresh flowers, pretty stones, occasionally a ribbon or a bell. These items would disappear overnight, only to be replaced by other curious objects: smooth pebbles that seemed to glow in the moonlight, peculiarly shaped leaves that sparkled with morning dew, tiny braids of grass tied with strands of silver thread. One particularly clear evening, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I decided to sit on the porch and watch the swing. The air was perfectly still, yet the swing moved with its usual gentle rhythm. As I watched, the movement seemed to create patterns in the air, like ripples in a pond. The creaking of the chains formed a harmony with the evening sounds: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and that ever-present, barely audible humming. In that moment, I understood something my grandmother had tried to tell me without words. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but rather experienced and accepted. The swing held stories that existed in the space between reality and dreams, in the quiet moments between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths. I began to notice other subtle changes in the garden. Flowers bloomed out of season, their petals gleaming with an unusual iridescence in the moonlight. Moths with wings like stained glass would gather around the swing at dusk, their patterns creating shifting mandalas in the air. The grass around the oak tree grew in perfect circles, each ring a slightly different shade of green. As autumn deepened into winter, the swing's movement became more subtle, like a whispered secret. On snowy evenings, I would watch from my window as snowflakes swirled around it in impossible patterns, dancing to that familiar, unnamed melody. The swing never collected snow, remaining pristine while everything around it was blanketed in white. I found my grandmother's diary while cleaning out the attic, its pages filled with careful observations of the swing and its mysteries. She had documented years of unusual occurrences: children's laughter when the garden was empty, the appearance of unfamiliar flowers that grew nowhere else, the way certain birds would gather on the oak's branches and sing songs that seemed almost human. The final entry in her diary read, "The swing chooses its guardians carefully. It has been my honor to watch over it these many years. Now it's time for another to inherit its mysteries. Remember, some magic needs no explanation, only acceptance and care. The swing will teach you everything you need to know if you learn to listen with your heart instead of your mind." Now, as I sit by my window each evening, watching the swing's gentle motion and listening to its quiet song, I understand what she meant. There is peace in accepting that some questions don't need answers, that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. The swing continues its eternal dance, moving to a rhythm only it fully understands, and I have learned to find comfort in its gentle presence. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the moon is full and the air is thick with possibility, I catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye. Shadowy figures that might be children playing, the flutter of clothing that could be from another time, the echo of laughter that sounds both ancient and new. But I never turn to look directly. Never try to capture these moments with more than my peripheral vision. Some things are meant to be experienced like dreams, soft, ephemeral, and just beyond our grasp. The swing keeps its own counsel, moving to its own rhythm, sharing its secrets only with those who learn to listen without expecting to understand. And in this acceptance, in this gentle surrender to mystery, I have found a peace I never knew I was seeking. The swing that moves alone has become more than just an inherited curiosity. It has become a reminder that magic still exists in the world, if we only learn to recognize it in its quieter forms. As I write these words, the swing continues its gentle motion in the gathering dusk, its creaking a lullaby that bridges the gap between what we know and what we feel. And somehow, that is enough. Story 7. The autumn breeze whispered through the dense forest, carrying with it the earthy scent of fallen leaves and morning dew. I sat in my grandmother's old rocking chair on the wraparound porch, watching the mist roll down from the hills like gentle waves of silk. The wooden planks beneath my feet creaked rhythmically as I rocked back and forth, each sound merging with the soft symphony of early morning birds and rustling branches. My grandmother had lived in this house for over 60 years before passing away last spring, leaving me not just the property, but also the weight of its memories and mysteries. The house itself seemed to breathe with history, its weathered walls holding countless stories that I was only beginning to uncover. As I sat there that morning, wrapped in one of her old quilts, my eyes were drawn to the rolling hills that dominated the landscape beyond the garden. There was something different about the view today. The mist, usually a uniform blanket of gray, appeared to part slightly near the crest of the furthest hill. Through this natural window, I caught glimpses of what looked like distant rooftops and maybe even a church spire. In all the summers I had spent here visiting my grandmother, I had never noticed any signs of civilization in that direction. The sight sparked a memory of something she had once told me, late one night when I was young and struggling to sleep. She had spoken of a village that appeared and disappeared with the changing seasons, visible only during certain phases of the moon when the mist parted just so. I'd always assumed it was just another of her bedtime stories, meant to quiet a restless child with wonder rather than fear. As I watched, the mist shifted again, and the distant shapes became clearer. The rooftops seemed to be thatched, their angles sharp against the soft gray sky. The church spire rose higher than I had first thought, its weathered stones somehow both ancient and timeless. Small wisps of what might have been chimney smoke rose from several points in the village, though they were nearly indistinguishable from the surrounding mist. The sight filled me with an inexplicable sense of peace, even as questions multiplied in my mind. I found myself reaching for my grandmother's old leather-bound journal, which I had discovered in the attic just days ago. Its pages were filled with her elegant handwriting, documenting decades of observations about the house, the surrounding land, and most intriguingly, the mysterious village beyond the hill. As I leafed through the journal, the paper's texture rough beneath my fingertips, I found entries that spoke of lights seen in the distance on certain nights, of bell sounds carried on the wind when no churches were known to exist in that direction. My grandmother had documented it all with the precision of a scientist and the wonder of a poet, her words painting pictures that matched exactly what I now saw before me. One entry in particular caught my attention, dated exactly 50 years ago to the day. The village has shown itself again today, clearer than ever before. I watched as figures moved between the buildings, their forms obscured by distance and mist, but their movements purposeful and unhurried. The bell in the church tower rang 3 times, though no sound reached my ears. I have come to believe that what I see is not merely a trick of light and shadow, but something far more wonderful and complex. Time moves differently there, I think. The seasons change according to rules I cannot comprehend. I looked up from the journal, and the village seemed to have shifted slightly, as if responding to my attention. The morning sun, now higher in the sky, caught the windows of the distant buildings, creating tiny points of light that winked through the mist like stars. The effect was mesmerizing, and I found myself sinking deeper into the rocking chair, my grandmother's quilt pulled tight around my shoulders. The gentle creaking of the chair became a metronome, marking time as I watched the village reveal and conceal itself through the dancing mist. Sometimes I could see the entire collection of buildings, arranged in a pattern that suggested centuries of organic growth rather than planned development. Other times, only the church spire remained visible, a silent sentinel piercing the gray veil. As morning stretched into afternoon, I began to notice other details. Gardens seemed to surround the village, their geometric patterns visible even at this distance. The colors were muted by the mist, but I could make out what appeared to be rows of vegetables and herbs, reminding me of my grandmother's own carefully tended garden below the porch. Had she modeled her garden after what she saw in the distance, I wondered, or was I simply seeing what I wanted to see? The journal provided more clues as I continued reading. My grandmother had made detailed sketches of the village layout, each drawing dated and annotated with observations about changes she noticed. According to her notes, the village seemed to follow its own internal logic, with buildings appearing and disappearing based on some pattern she had spent years trying to decipher. A particularly intriguing entry described how she had once attempted to walk to the village. She set out early one morning, packing a small lunch and her notebook, determined to solve the mystery. But no matter how long she walked, the village remained at the same apparent distance, as if moving away at the exact pace of her approach. She returned home at sunset, physically exhausted but mentally invigorated by the experience. As I read this, I felt a familiar stirring of curiosity, the same feeling that had often led me to explore the woods around the house as a child. But there was something different about this mystery. It didn't demand to be solved. Instead, it invited contemplation, offering a gentle reminder that some things in life are meant to be observed and appreciated rather than understood. The afternoon light began to soften, taking on the golden quality that precedes sunset. The village appeared to respond to the changing light, its buildings seeming to glow from within. The church spire caught the last direct rays of sunlight, its stone surface warming to a rich honey color that stood out against the deepening blue of the sky. I noticed movement again between the buildings, or perhaps it was just the mist shifting in the evening breeze. The forms I saw might have been people going about their daily routines, or they might have been shadows dancing in the fading light. The uncertainty felt appropriate somehow, adding to rather than detracting from the scene's peaceful atmosphere. My grandmother's last journal entry, written just weeks before she passed away, took on new meaning as I watched the village in the gathering dusk. I have come to understand that the village is not meant to be reached, but rather to remind us of the mystery that still exists in the world. In all my years of watching, I have never seen it the same way twice, yet its presence has been a constant comfort. Like life itself, it is ever-changing yet somehow eternal, always just beyond our grasp, but forever calling to something deep within us. As darkness began to settle over the landscape, small lights appeared in the village windows, each one a tiny beacon in the growing night. They flickered like stars fallen to earth, creating patterns that seemed to hold meaning just beyond my understanding. The sight reminded me of winter evenings spent with my grandmother, when she would tell stories by candlelight as the wind whispered around the house's old walls. The church bell tower was now just a darker shape against the night sky, but I could swear I felt rather than heard the vibration of its bells. The sensation resonated somewhere in my chest, a gentle reminder of connections that transcend ordinary understanding. My grandmother had written about this too, the way the village seemed to communicate through feelings rather than sound, through impressions rather than images. As night fully embraced the landscape, the village lights continued to twinkle through the darkness, now resembling a constellation that had chosen to rest upon the hill rather than in the sky above. The sight filled me with a profound sense of peace, an acceptance of the mystery before me. I understood now why my grandmother had spent so many hours in this very spot, watching and wondering. I closed her journal and set it aside, content to simply observe as the village lights danced in the distance. The rocking chair's gentle motion and the soft night sounds created a cocoon of tranquility around me. Whether the village was real in any conventional sense seemed less important than the feeling of connection it created. Connection to this place, to my grandmother's memory, and to the endless possibilities that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we wonder. As sleep began to creep over me, I realized that I had inherited more than just a house. I had inherited a mystery, a wonder, a daily reminder that the world is far more magical than we often allow ourselves to believe. The village beyond the hill would continue its ethereal dance of appearance and disappearance, and I would be here to watch, to wonder, and to add my own observations to my grandmother's journal. In the last moments before I drifted off to sleep, wrapped in the quilt that still carried traces of my grandmother's lavender sachets, I thought I heard the distant sound of singing carried on the night wind. The melody was unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. It merged with the natural sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, creating a symphony that seemed to bridge the gap between the world I knew and the one that shimmered just beyond reach. The village beyond the hill had become my inheritance, my mystery to watch over, and as I finally surrendered to sleep, I felt deeply grateful for this gift of wonder that my grandmother had left behind. Story 8. The gentle patter of rain against the library's towering windows created a soothing rhythm that seemed to pulse through the ancient building. I sat alone at my usual reading desk, surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound books that disappeared into shadows above. The warm glow of brass reading lamps created pools of amber light that dotted the vast space like stars in a paper universe. I had been coming to this library for months, drawn by its peculiar charm and the way time seemed to flow differently within its walls. The building itself was an architectural marvel, with its high Gothic arches and endless corridors of books. The wood-paneled walls held centuries of whispered conversations, and the air carried the comforting scent of old paper and leather bindings. That evening, I was particularly absorbed in a collection of 19th century poetry when I first noticed something unusual. The sound of the rain had changed, becoming somehow deeper, as if the droplets were falling through more than just physical space. I looked up from my book, allowing my eyes to adjust to the dimness beyond my reading lamp. The familiar shelves seemed different now, their shadows longer and more complex than I remembered. The warm pools of lamplight appeared to pulse gently, like sleeping creatures breathing in the dark. I checked my watch, thinking perhaps I had lost track of time, but the hands appeared to be moving backward, slowly but surely, as if time itself was unwinding. Rising from my chair, I decided it was time to leave. The library usually closed at 9, and while I hadn't heard the usual announcement, the quality of silence suggested lateness. I gathered my belongings and headed toward where I knew the exit should be, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet runner that stretched down the center of each aisle. The first sign that something was truly amiss came when I reached the spot where the main entrance should have been. Instead of the heavy oak doors I had entered through countless times before, I found only more shelves, these ones filled with books I had never seen before. Their spines bore no titles, only intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. I turned around, thinking I must have taken a wrong turn, but the path behind me had changed as well. The reading desk where I had been sitting was nowhere in sight. Instead, new corridors of books stretched out in every direction, all identical in their warm lighting and endless rows. The rain continued its gentle symphony against the windows, but now I noticed that I couldn't see outside through them anymore. The glass had become opaque, like frosted crystal, diffusing the dim light that filtered through from an unknown source. As I walked through the transformed library, I began to notice other subtle changes. The books seemed to respond to my presence, their spines tilting slightly as I passed, as if trying to catch my attention. The air grew thick with the scent of old paper, but beneath it was something else, the mineral smell of stone crypts and forgotten places. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books as I walked, feeling their texture change beneath my touch. Some felt warm, almost alive, while others were cool as marble. One volume in particular caught my attention, a small blue book that seemed to hum beneath my fingers. When I pulled it from the shelf, its pages were blank, yet I could have sworn I saw words flickering across them, just at the edge of perception. The brass reading lamps continued their steady illumination, but their light now seemed to follow me, creating a protective bubble of warmth as I moved through the stacks. Outside this bubble, the darkness grew deeper, more velvet, more complete. Yet it wasn't threatening. Instead, it felt like being wrapped in a heavy blanket on a cold night. Time became impossible to track. My watch had stopped entirely now, its hands pointing to impossible hours. The rain's rhythm remained constant, a gentle metronome marking moments that no longer seemed to pass in any normal way. I found myself walking in patterns that couldn't exist in ordinary space. Turning left 4 times should have brought me back to where I started, but instead led to new areas of the library I had never seen before. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, the flutter of pages turning themselves, or what looked like shadows reading books in distant corners. But whenever I turned to look directly, I found only the familiar sight of books and more books, stretching into infinity. The leather-bound volumes began to arrange themselves in patterns that almost made sense, like words in a language I was just on the verge of understanding. Their colors shifted subtly, deep reds bleeding into midnight blues, forest greens morphing into royal purples, all while maintaining their solid physical presence. I discovered reading nooks I was certain hadn't existed before, each one more inviting than the last. Comfortable armchairs appeared in corners, accompanied by small tables that held cups of tea that were somehow always at the perfect drinking temperature. The tea's steam rose in patterns that looked like cursive writing against the air. As I explored, I began to understand that the library was no longer just a building containing books. It had become something else entirely. The books weren't simply bound pages anymore, but rather windows into other places, other times, other possibilities. When I opened them, I could feel the stories breathing, could sense the characters moving just beyond the veil of paper and ink. The rain's rhythm changed again, now sounding like soft whispers in a language I almost recognized. The words seemed to be telling a story, my story perhaps, or the library's story, or maybe the story of everyone who had ever lost themselves in a book. I found myself at a reading desk again, though not the one where I had started. This one was crafted from darker wood, its surface marked with intricate carvings that might have been words or might have been maps. A book lay open upon it, its pages blank but somehow full of meaning. As I sat down, I noticed that the chair felt like it had been waiting for me, shaped perfectly to welcome my presence. The brass lamp on the desk cast its warm glow over the blank pages, and in its light, I began to see faint traces of text appearing and disappearing, like words written in water. They told stories of other visitors to this impossible library, of people who had found themselves wrapped in its endless embrace. Some had stayed for hours that stretched into years, while others had found their way back to the outside world, forever changed by their time among the living books. I realized then that I was no longer searching for an exit. The library had become something more than a place I needed to escape from. It had become a space between spaces, a moment between moments, where the usual rules of time and physics bowed to the deeper logic of stories and dreams. The rain continued its gentle fall, now sounding like the turning of countless pages. The darkness beyond my circle of lamplight felt like a gentle guardian rather than an obstacle, and the endless shelves of books stood like silent companions in my vigil. Whether I had been there for hours or days or years no longer seemed to matter. As I write these words in the blank book before me, I understand that they too will become part of the library's endless collection. Perhaps someone else will find them someday, another wanderer in this labyrinth of literature. They might sit at this very desk, reading my story as the rain falls and the lamps glow and the books whisper their secrets. I'm still here, in the library that has no exit, and I'm no longer sure I want to leave. The books keep me company, the rain sings me to sleep, and the darkness holds me like a cherished memory. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of other readers in distant corners, fellow travelers in this literary limbo, but we never quite meet. Perhaps that's for the best. We each have our own stories to read, our own paths to wander through these endless stacks. The rain falls, the lamps glow, and somewhere in the darkness, another book is opening its pages to tell its tale. In this place where time has no meaning, where space folds in on itself like the pages of a well-loved book, I have found something I never knew I was looking for, a home in the heart of an infinite story. And so I remain, surrounded by the gentle breathing of books, writing my own chapter in the library's endless tale. Whether this is reality or dream no longer matters. In a place where stories live and breathe, perhaps there is no difference. The rain continues to fall, the lamps continue to glow, and somewhere in the distance, another reader loses themselves in the library without an exit. Story 9. The soft whisper of wind through autumn leaves accompanied my footsteps as I made my way along the gravel path. Night had settled early, as it often did during this time of year, wrapping the world in a gentle darkness that seemed to muffle even the sound of my breathing. The old manor house loomed ahead, its weathered stone facade barely visible in the dim light of a cloud-covered moon. I had inherited this place from my grandmother just 2 weeks ago, and still, every evening as I returned from my walks, the sight of it stirred something deep within me, a mixture of comfort and unease that I couldn't quite explain. The house itself was beautiful, with its Victorian architecture and sprawling grounds, but it was the garden that had captured my attention from the very first day. The garden wrapped around the entire property like a protective embrace, filled with carefully planned pathways and meticulously maintained flower beds. What made it truly special, though, were the hundreds of antique garden lights that dotted the landscape, delicate iron structures with glass globes that hadn't been lit in decades. My grandmother had mentioned them in her diaries, speaking of how they once illuminated the gardens every evening, creating what she called a symphony of light and shadow. Tonight, as I approached the house, something felt different. The air held a peculiar stillness, like the moment before a piano string is struck. The temperature had dropped slightly, causing my breath to form subtle clouds in the evening air. As I reached for my keys, a flicker of movement caught my eye, something in the garden, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. I turned slowly, scanning the darkened landscape. The garden lights stood like silent sentinels, their glass globes collecting what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. For a moment, I could have sworn one of them had glowed just faintly with a pale blue light. But that was impossible. The electrical system that once powered them had long since been disconnected. Inside the house, I went through my evening routine, brewing a cup of chamomile tea and settling into the window seat in the library that overlooked the eastern portion of the garden. The room smelled of old books and leather, with undertones of the beeswax polish I'd used on the woodwork earlier that day. As I sipped my tea, I found myself drawn to the garden again, watching the spaces between the unlit lamps. That's when I saw it again, a soft, ethereal glow emanating from one of the garden lights near the old fountain. It lasted only a few seconds before fading away, like the afterimage of a dream. I set my tea down, the porcelain cup making a gentle clink against its saucer, and moved closer to the window. The glass was cool against my forehead as I pressed closer, straining to see into the darkness. Another light flickered to life, this time closer to the house. Then another, further back near the rose arbor. They weren't bright, more like the gentle glow of fireflies than electric bulbs, but they were unmistakably real. The light they cast was soft and blue-tinged, creating pools of illumination that seemed to ripple and move, even though the globes themselves remained stationary. I found myself reaching for my grandmother's journals, which I'd been gradually reading since moving in. Settling back into the window seat, I began to flip through the pages, looking for any mention of the lights behaving strangely. The paper was thick and slightly textured beneath my fingers, and the scent of aged paper filled my nostrils as I turned each page. In an entry dated 40 years ago, I found something interesting. My grandmother wrote about the lights, describing how they would sometimes come on by themselves, even after the electricity had been cut off. She didn't seem frightened by this phenomenon. Rather, she wrote about it with a sense of wonder and reverence. "The lights know," she had written in her elegant, flowing script. They remember the celebrations, the quiet evenings, the whispered conversations that happened beneath their glow. Sometimes, I think they're trying to tell us something, to share the stories they've witnessed over the years. As I read these words, a gentle tapping sound drew my attention back to the window. A light rain had begun to fall, creating a soothing rhythm against the glass. In the garden, more lights had begun to glow, creating a meandering path that wound through the flower beds and around the fountain. The sight was mesmerizing. Each light seemed to pulse gently, like a beating heart. Setting the journal aside, I found myself drawn to the garden door. The brass handle was cool beneath my palm as I turned it, stepping out onto the covered porch. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and night-blooming jasmine. Droplets of water fell from the porch roof in a steady curtain. But beyond, in the garden, the glowing lights created a otherworldly scene. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching as the lights would fade and then rekindle, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Sometimes they would illuminate in sequence, creating paths through the garden. Other times, they would glow in clusters, like constellations brought down to earth. The rain continued its gentle percussion, and I found myself thinking about all the people who must have walked these paths before me. Generations of my family had lived here, had tended these gardens, and walked beneath these lights. How many conversations had these lights witnessed? How many secrets had been shared in their gentle glow? As the night deepened, I noticed something else. In the pools of blue light cast by the garden lamps, shadows moved in ways that didn't quite match the swaying of branches and leaves. They seemed to take on forms, not quite human, but not entirely abstract either. They danced at the edge of perception, like memories trying to take shape. I didn't feel afraid. Instead, I was filled with a profound sense of peace and connection to this place. The garden was sharing its memories with me, in its own quiet way. Through the gentle dance of light and shadow, it was telling me stories that couldn't be put into words. Gradually, as the night wore on, the lights began to fade one by one, like stars disappearing at dawn. The last one to go out was the lamp nearest to the porch where I stood. As its glow dimmed, I could have sworn I heard something. Not quite a voice, but a sound that carried the same weight as words. It felt like a goodbye, or perhaps a until next time. I made my way back inside, my footsteps echoing softly on the hardwood floors. In the library, my tea had gone cold, but I didn't mind. I picked up my grandmother's journal again, running my fingers over her words. On the next page, I found an entry I hadn't noticed before. The garden holds more than just flowers and paths. It holds time itself, moments preserved in light and shadow. The lights are the keepers of these memories, and sometimes when the night is right and the air is still, they share them with those who are willing to watch and listen. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the continuing rhythm of the rain, I understood what she meant. The garden wasn't just a garden. It was a living archive of memories, and the lights were its voice. Each glow, each flicker, was a story being told in a language of luminescence and shadow. I've been here for several months now, and the lights continue their nocturnal display, though not every night. Sometimes weeks will pass without a single glow, and then, on a quiet evening when the air holds just the right amount of moisture and the moon is hidden behind clouds, they'll come alive again. Each time, the pattern is different, the story new. I've started keeping my own journal, documenting each occurrence, though words seem inadequate to capture the true nature of what I witness. How does one describe the way memories look when they're translated into light? How can language capture the feeling of standing in a garden where time itself seems to pool and eddy like water? The locals have their theories about the lights, of course. Some say it's swamp gas, others blame electrical anomalies or reflections from distant cars. But I know better. I've seen how the lights respond to different nights, different moods. I've watched them create patterns that feel like conversations, like they're trying to tell me something important. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I sit in the garden until dawn, watching the play of light and shadow. The air grows cool around me, heavy with dew, but I hardly notice. I'm too absorbed in the silent stories being told by these ancient lights. Each flicker feels like a word, each pattern a sentence in a story that's been unfolding for generations. What draws me back night after night isn't just the mystery of how these lights continue to glow without power. It's the sense that I'm being shown something precious, memories preserved in light, stories told in the language of illumination and darkness. The garden has become more than just a place. It's become a conversation between past and present, between the seen and unseen. And sometimes in those moments between sleeping and waking, I think I understand what the lights are trying to tell me. But like the memory of a dream, the understanding slips away as consciousness returns, leaving behind only a feeling, a sense of connection to something vast and gentle and impossibly old. The lights continue their silent vigil in the garden, and I continue to watch and wonder. Perhaps one day I'll fully understand their language, or perhaps the mystery is itself the message. Until then, I'll keep watching the garden of unlit lights, where memories glow like stars fallen to earth, and time moves to the rhythm of flickering blue flames. In the end, maybe that's what the garden is. Not just a place where lights mysteriously glow, but a space where time bends and folds, where memories take on physical form in pools of ghostly light. And perhaps that's why I feel so at peace here, even on the strangest nights. Because in this garden, among these ancient lights, I'm never truly alone. I'm surrounded by stories, by memories, by moments preserved in light and shadow, waiting for someone to witness them once again. Story 10. The gentle whisper of an autumn breeze carried the scent of aged stone and wild roses through the crumbling archway before me. I stood there, my camera hanging loosely around my neck, taking in the peaceful solitude of the ancient ruins. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across weathered walls, their surfaces textured with centuries of stories untold. As a photographer specializing in historical architecture, I had visited countless abandoned places, but something about this particular site felt different, more alive somehow, despite its state of decay. The air held a peculiar quality, thick with moisture from the morning's rain and carrying the earthy fragrance of moss-covered stone. My footsteps were muffled by the carpet of fallen leaves that blanketed the ground, their rich amber and burgundy hues creating a natural pathway through the remnants of what must have once been a grand estate. The walls rose around me like silent sentinels, their weathered faces bearing witness to countless seasons of sun and rain, wind and snow. I raised my camera, focusing on a particularly striking section of wall where nature had begun to reclaim its territory. Delicate tendrils of ivy wound their way through cracks in the masonry, and patches of soft green moss created living tapestries across the ancient stones. Through my viewfinder, I noticed something unusual. A faint shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, except the day was cool and crisp. The sound of my camera's shutter seemed unusually loud in the stillness, echoing off the walls in a way that made me pause. As the echo faded, I became aware of other sounds, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of birds, and something else. Something that seemed to exist just at the edge of hearing. It was almost like music, but not quite. More like the memory of music, or perhaps the ghost of a long-forgotten melody. Moving deeper into the ruins, I found myself in what must have once been a grand hall. Sections of the ceiling remained intact, creating a complex pattern of light and shadow on the floor below. Dust motes danced in the slanting beams of sunlight that penetrated through gaps in the roof, giving the space an ethereal quality. The air here felt different, heavier, more charged with possibility. I set up my tripod, carefully adjusting its legs on the uneven floor. Through my lens, I studied the interplay of light and shadow, waiting for the perfect moment when the sun's angle would highlight the texture of the ancient stonework. As I waited, I became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The temperature seemed to drop slightly, and the quality of light shifted, though I couldn't see any clouds passing overhead. The wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the floor in lazy spirals. Yet something about their movement seemed almost purposeful, as if they were tracing patterns that held some deeper meaning. I found myself following their dance through my viewfinder, mesmerized by their fluid motion. In the background of one frame, I noticed something that made me lower my camera slowly. A faint, translucent shape that seemed to move independently of the wind-blown leaves. Curious rather than afraid, I adjusted my position to get a better view. The shape was barely visible now, like a ripple in the air, moving with a grace that seemed almost human. As I watched, the temperature dropped further, and the strange, almost music I had noticed earlier became slightly clearer. It reminded me of the sound of wind through glass bottles, or perhaps distant wind chimes, but with an underlying melody that tugged at my memory. The sun continued its slow descent, and the shadows lengthened across the ruins. The light took on the warm, golden quality that photographers call the magic hour. But there was something else magical happening here that had nothing to do with natural light. The shimmering in the air had become more pronounced, and now I could see multiple shapes moving through the space, like dancers performing a slow, graceful waltz. I began taking photographs almost automatically, my hands steady despite the otherworldly scene before me. Through my viewfinder, I noticed that the shapes seemed more defined, more clearly visible than they did to my naked eye. They appeared to be wearing clothes from another era, long dresses and formal suits that spoke of elegant balls and grand celebrations. The almost music grew stronger, though it remained just quiet enough that I had to strain to hear it. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very stones of the ruins were humming with remembered melodies. The dancing shapes moved in perfect time to this phantom orchestra, their movements elegant and precise. As the sun sank lower, casting the last of its golden light through the broken windows, the dancers became more distinct. I could almost make out their faces now, peaceful, serene expressions that seemed both present and distant, as if they existed in multiple times at once. They paid me no attention, completely absorbed in their eternal dance. The air grew colder still, and my breath began to form small clouds in the fading light. The dancers continued their waltz, but now I could see other shapes moving through the ruins. Servants carrying phantom trays, musicians with instruments that made no sound I could hear, ladies with fans, and gentlemen with walking sticks. It was as if I was witnessing a moment in time that had somehow become trapped in these ancient walls, playing out again and again like a scene in a music box. I lost track of time as I photographed the spectacle before me, my finger pressing the shutter release almost mechanically. The light continued to fade, and as it did, the figures became more visible, their forms more substantial. Yet there was never a moment when they became completely solid. They remained translucent, like figures seen through gauze or smoke. The wind picked up again, stronger now, and with it came the scent of roses. Not the wild roses I had smelled earlier, but something more cultivated, more refined. It was the scent of a carefully tended garden, of summer evenings and formal parties. Mixed with it was the faint aroma of beeswax candles and aged wood, smells that had no place in these open, weathered ruins. As darkness began to settle over the ruins, the figures started to fade. The phantom music grew fainter, and the dancers became less distinct, their movements slower, more dreamlike. One by one, they faded away like morning mist under the sun, until only the whisper of the wind remained. I stood in the growing darkness, my camera heavy in my hands, wondering what I had witnessed. The temperature began to return to normal, and the scent of roses faded, replaced once again by the earthier smell of moss and ancient stone. The ruins felt empty now, but not in an unsettling way. Rather, they felt peaceful, as if they were resting after the evening's performance. Later that night, in my small cabin nearby, I reviewed the photographs on my laptop. Most showed only empty ruins, beautiful but ordinary in the golden light of sunset. But in a few, just a few, I could see faint, translucent shapes moving through the frame, their edges soft and dreamlike. They were proof, perhaps, that what I had seen was real, or at least as real as anything can be in a place where time seems to flow differently. As I prepare for sleep, the wind still whispers around the eaves of my cabin, and in its sound, I imagine I can hear the faintest echo of that phantom waltz. Tomorrow, I will return to the ruins, not to capture what I saw. I know somehow that such things appear only when they choose to, but to sit quietly among the ancient stones and listen to their stories. In the days and weeks that follow, I visit many other ruins, each with their own mysteries and secrets. But none quite match the elegant melancholy of that autumn evening, when the veil between past and present grew thin enough to glimpse the dancers in their eternal waltz. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I think I can still hear that almost music, calling me back to those weathered walls where time flows like water, and memories dance like leaves in an autumn breeze.